everyone. I'm so glad you're here. Our guest speaker tonight is Sandra Fluke, who is the California State Director of an advocacy organization that is focused on climate change, economic inequality, campaign finance reform, immigration, healthcare, and criminal justice, which are pretty much a summation of the forums we do here on a regular basis. She's going to bring us up to date on what's going on in Sacramento right now. If you have paper or you write notes in your phone, you may want to take some notes so we can find out what we want to contact Senator Stern or Assemblywoman Irwin about, and so we too can be part of transforming our world through justice and compassion. Ms. Fluke was a state Senate candidate in 2014, and you might remember her name from when she garnered national attention by testifying before Congress regarding insurance coverage for birth control, and was pilloried and made famous by Rush Limbaugh. Boo hiss. Anyway, I'm thrilled she is here to talk with us tonight. I have over here a sign-in sheet if you want to get on her mailing list. I'll be putting that around later. Sandra, thank you for coming.
Is it on? There we go. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out on a Friday night. I'm very excited to be here talking with you, and I have to say, my father is a pastor, so I'm used to him being up here. It's a different moment for me to be up here, but I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about tonight. I was speaking with some of the conveners just before I came up, and I said, is this a really formal audience? Okay, good. So you got the same answer I got. So I will say I love sort of having a conversation with the audience and talking with all of you and hearing what you want to hear about and what you're passionate about, and making sure that I can kind of be of service to you in your effort to transform the world through justice and compassion, and that I'm giving you the information you came out tonight to get. Does that sound good? Excellent. So why don't I begin by saying just a little bit about Sacramento sort of generally. How many folks have sort of ever been to Sacramento or follow state politics or... Okay, you are exceptional, if you don't already know that. So many folks are MSNBC junkies and very focused on the federal government, which the federal government, to be clear, is very important. It's just that nothing is more important than what happens in California. See? Yeah. To that point for just a moment, because I suspect that many of you, like me, feel very distressed by some of the policy changes that are happening at our federal government level, and sometimes it can feel odd to be in California, to be sort of among the privileged few where we're seeing good policy happening in our state, and it can feel like we're not in the same fight that the rest of the country is in, and what is our role in that fight, and shouldn't we be focusing all of our efforts on what's happening federally, and why would we focus on Sacramento? Has anyone ever felt that way? Excellent. Also an honest crowd. You're just racking up points. I think there's merit to some of that. I obviously focus on things that are happening in some other states and federally, huge fights that I try to do what I can on. But I always want to remember how important our role is as well. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that there are just a few states that are the role models for other states in terms of policy and legislation. And this is actually not California ego right now when I'm saying this. There are states that their legislature works part-time, or they barely get paid, or they meet for sort of like 1 month out of the year. Our legislature is a full-time policy-making body, a world-class debate. And so the legislation we pass here, the policy that we craft, that we figure out how to tackle important problems, that becomes a model for other states, and that really is true. Now, places like Texas are also a model. We can talk later about which one's a better model. So we really do have an important role in helping other states to see what are some model policies that they can pass. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and other Supreme Court justices have called this the laboratory of democracy, the idea that states experiment and then these types of policy solutions get adopted at the federal level. So what we do matters for that reason, number one, and especially in this moment where California is trying to figure out how to respond to some of the things that are happening federally. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Number two, we are, in my opinion, the tip of the spear in the resistance. And that matters. There are states where they are fighting with everything they've got to stop from being dragged backwards, right? On things like reproductive rights, on things like immigration, on social services, a whole range of issues. And how many of you have ever been involved in a movement? Just, yeah, I mean, you're here, so. How do movements do when they're only on defense, right? Everyone needs inspiration. And it is important that movements have an offense as well as a defense. We are the offense. I sometimes call this the dead shark theory of social change, and I'll explain that. Do you all know that if a shark stops swimming forward, it dies? We do not want our movements to be a dead shark. We want to keep moving forward, and California is a big part of doing that for the rest of the country and making sure that we're continuing to move that goalpost forward. We're also a place that candidates in other parts of the country can point to California and say, see, it works. You know, there are places where the economy, and our economy here is not perfect by a long stretch, but the policies that we put in place do achieve real economic outcomes, and that can be a demonstration to other places. So have I convinced that all of you should stay and none of you should move? Okay, so those are some of the reasons that I think that state policy here in California is important. Now, if I get this statistic right, each year we send about 900 bills to Governor Brown's desk, and those are the ones that make it to his desk. So there's an enormous amount happening in Sacramento, so I'm going to talk about every one of those bills tonight. And you're going to take notes, and we will all be on time for work on Monday morning. No, and I'll also say that you know a lot about Sacramento. Many of you are a very informed audience. For those of you who aren't, Sacramento works a little differently than DC. It works on a very regimented schedule. All the bills get introduced at the beginning of the year, and then they all go through the first house, right? Either the Assembly or the Senate, whichever one they start in, and then they go to the other house, and then they go to the governor, and there are deadlines for all of that. So, and there are ways around those deadlines too. But we try to have it run on a schedule, as it were, and that means that we are right at the beginning of the year. So we do have a 2-year legislative cycle, right? So we're halfway through, but we're right at the beginning of this year, which means a lot of the legislation in Sacramento right now is really not cooked. You've heard the term half-baked. It's like a quarter-baked at this point. So things are still being figured out. That means it's a great time to be weighing in with your ideas, to be influencing your legislators, but it also means, I might say, a lot of to be determined tonight in answer to some of your questions and things like that. Okay, so I think I've sort of set the stage. You can leave now if you want. I would love to hear what issues you all care most about, or let me adjust that slightly, what you want to hear from me most about, and I will try to do my best to address the ones you want to the best of my ability. Yes, ma'am.
Should California develop their own health insurance plan?
Okay, I'm going to expand that question to health insurance, but you should run for office. That's a very good question. What other topics other than healthcare and health insurance? Yes. Oh yes, yes. Yes. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I can repeat them. This is about, you might know of it as like the tubes, the tunnels, directing water down. This is Governor Brown's water plan. Yes, sir. Affordable housing, you think? Yeah. Ma'am. Immigration, yes. It's weighing heavily on all of our hearts. Ma'am. Uh-huh. Is anybody writing this down? If you would take notes, that'll help me to touch on as many things as I can. We got affordable housing, the water plan, healthcare, health insurance, immigration, and offshore oil drilling. The bullet train, high-speed rail. Yep. Okay, so you don't want to stay all night. I got it. Okay. Reproductive rights. Yeah, those matter. Okay, does that give a good... Yes, ma'am? Climate change. Excellent. Important. Sir? Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question too. I'll answer that one first. How about that? So I am the state director of an advocacy organization. I've left out the name and such because I'm not speaking on their behalf tonight. These crazy opinions that I'm sharing are my own. And my organization engages on advocacy and legislation primarily around climate change, economic inequality and opportunity, as well as other forms of social justice, and strengthening democracy through things like campaign finance reform and voting protections. We work at both the federal level and in Sacramento. If that, yes, you may. Okay, I'm going to start working through the list. How about that? Let's see. What's the easy thing to start with? Let's start with immigration. How about that? So immigration is primarily a federal issue, if you think from a legal point of view. But there's a lot we can do in states to try, frankly, to protect the folks who live within our communities who are very much under attack right now. The biggest news was the passage of the California Values Act last year. You may have heard it referred to as the Sanctuary State Bill. There are some reasons that I don't call it that, but the California Values Act, this was a really big step forward. I actually worked to help pass this legislation, and it was, as I said earlier, this is an example of model legislation that will impact other states and that we hope other states will pick up on. So it helps to make sure that our local and state law enforcement and public safety officers are focused on public safety and not on helping to remove people who are no threat to our public safety. So for me, this is not only an issue of immigration policy, this is also about good stewardship of our public tax dollars, the ones we paid for public safety, and not for what I believe is immoral immigration enforcement. So the California Values Act was passed last year. There was also a number of efforts to fund things like attorneys for undocumented immigrants in their removal proceedings. You know, that whole right to an attorney, that only applies in certain situations. So other places you don't have a right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, you can really be in trouble. So helping to fund some of those kinds of efforts and trainings and things like that. Yes, ma'am. Yes, I should say this. Kevin De Leon, who's currently the pro tem of the state Senate, and also just factually, this is not an endorsement, factually, he's running for the U.S. Senate. He was the author of the California Values Act. And a number of folks were very supportive, but he was really the lead. Yes, sir. Ooh, that's a very good question. Why don't we talk after, and I'll if nothing else, I will get your information so that I can get you the answer to that question. Yeah, because it's somewhat complicated. In terms of immigration, one of the things that I know will be coming up this year is that there's talk about trying to figure out how to get health care to a lot of our immigrant population. There's been efforts to expand it to kids, but it hasn't expanded to adults. So that's one of the things that is on the table in terms of immigration this coming year. It was a really, really hot topic last year, so it's possible there might be less this year. But again, we're just at the beginning, so we don't know the full spectrum quite yet. So that's a little bit on immigration, if that's helpful. Let's see, we also had climate change on the list, right? So climate change, California has been an incredible leader on climate change. We haven't been perfect, but we've certainly been an international leader in this policy area. Much of that is to the credit of Governor Brown, who is, again, not perfect, but incredible leadership. And so one of the things that I would say, not from a partisan political point of view, but just in terms of being advocates and organizing in our community, we need to make sure this doesn't fall off the agenda or fall down on the agenda, because the next governor might say, oh, well, I want to go a different direction from Governor Brown. I want to differentiate myself, or we've done a lot on that. It's time to focus on something else. And it's possible this could really lose its place of prominence in Sacramento. And so we need to make sure we don't take our eye off the ball on one of the most pressing concerns for humanity. So that's the sort of overarching on climate change. And this connects to the question about offshore drilling. So many of you probably realize that the Trump administration has made a move to open up the federal waters off the coast of California and other democratically controlled states to offshore drilling. This is problematic in terms of the consequences for ocean life and for our habitat on the coast, for the beauty of our coast, for the animals and people who live there. We've seen so many oil spills. Santa Barbara probably most recently comes to mind and is not that far from here. But there's also another environmental reason, which certainly relates to climate change, which is that more and more advocates are focusing on an effort to keep it in the ground. And the reason I say keep it in the ground is that we're realizing that while we have all of these different policies to attack climate change, the root of the problem is that once that oil or that natural gas comes out of the ground, is mined, is drilled, it's got to be sold, right? The economic forces come into play, and there's a profit margin, and there are market forces that they got to get that into the supply chain somewhere. So one of our most perhaps efficient and effective strategies as advocates is to just stop that drilling. Try to keep it in the ground. Does this make sense So that applies not only in offshore drilling, but all kinds of drilling. So right now, this is a very hot topic in Sacramento. They're trying to figure out how to prevent the offshore drilling for both of these reasons. Now, this is a federal issue, right? The Trump administration did it. What can we do? Another prime example of California creativity is going to get exported to other places. The thing about oil that you drill out in the water, you want to take that somewhere. And you might want to take that through this huge state that occupies the entire left coast of this country. And that's our territory, President Trump. So there are efforts to say, no, you can't have any more leases, you can't have any more ability to transport, to bring to the coast. Right? It's very complicated in terms of the jurisdictional legal aspects, but that's one way I can summarize it, is to say, yeah, you can have that legally, but we're going to make all the other aspects of this very, very difficult. And so some of the commissions, the state commissions that have to do with the coast, have already taken some actions, and there is legislation pending this year that's going to be an even bigger step. If I remember correctly, it is Senator Scott Wiener's legislation. He's from San Francisco. And so that's going to be a great bill to be in support of. I'm planning and hoping to be working on it. I would expect that it would be a great one to call your assembly member, Jackie Irwin, and ask her to support, certainly. So that's a little bit on climate change and offshore drilling. Let's see, what else is on the list? Okay, let's talk about prison reform, and if I can expand that a little bit to criminal justice reform. So there's been some work on this in Sacramento, certainly in recent times. I have to say it's one of the areas where I don't think we're living up to the standards and the potential that we should be. I think we should be doing a better job as a state. There are some very powerful and conservative law enforcement lobbies in Sacramento. I say conservative law enforcement because they don't speak for all of law enforcement, but the conservative parts have a very loud voice, and so your voice is very much needed on this issue. One of the things that's under debate right now that started last year and is continuing is money bail reform. How many folks have heard about money bail reform, somewhere in the country? Why did you ask me to speak? You know everything. Raise your hand if you've learned anything so far. Oh, thank God. Good. I thought I was going to completely and utterly fail. Okay, good. So money bail reform is happening in Sacramento. There was actually just a court case in the appellate court here in one part of California that said that the way we've been doing it is unconstitutional, which is a fantastic decision by the court. The way we've been doing it is that essentially whether you get out of jail or not, and we're talking about pre-trial, before you've been found guilty, whether or not you sit in jail is just determined by how much money you have. And if you are wealthy and dangerous, you get out of jail. And if you are poor and not dangerous, you sit in jail. And if you are someone who does not have the money for bail, you've got a complicated but bad set of choices. Because you don't have the money, so you could sit there and lose your job because heaven knows you don't have paid time off. And potentially, if you're a single parent, your kids could get caught up in the foster care system, in the child welfare system, which is not a great place for kids as much as we try. And if you are, you probably don't have a nest egg, so you might lose your home. So you might end up being homeless as a result of not being able to work. And you have a lovely expression right now. You're like, which is exactly right. It's like, man, that's like all the different directions hitting you at the same time. It just sends families into an economic spiral. And something interesting that we learned as we were working on the bill this past year is that this actually hits women harder, which you wouldn't necessarily think, but women are the ones who have to post the bail when the men get arrested. And we know that African American and other communities of color, those men are getting arrested and those women are going to bail bonds persons and taking out these really awful agreements with them that are just exploitative is not even a strong enough word. So it's actually women whose economic futures are really being crushed by this system. So we're working to pass a bill which would instead allow judges and other court personnel to evaluate how much of a risk someone is, how dangerous they are in terms of letting them out into the community while they're waiting for their trial, and what is the likelihood that they will come back, and use those kinds of researched, proven tools to have them to determine who gets out and who doesn't, rather than money. Now, this is a tough fight in Sacramento. So please do call folks like Assemblymember Irwin and Senator Stern and encourage them on this, that we really need their support. Pardon? Yes, there is a number. Right now, it's Senate Bill 10, SB 10, by Senator Bob Hertzberg. It's possible that number could change, but trust me, if you say money bail reform, they'll know what you mean. Okay, other things that were on the list? Yeah, healthcare. Woo, is there a fight over healthcare in Sacramento? You might have heard, single payer. Have we heard about this fight? So, how many folks are supportive of a single payer system? Yeah, me too. The problem is, it's very complicated. It's a very hard time to get this done, because the federal government is just wreaking havoc on the healthcare system and trying to do even more. We defeated the full repeal of the Affordable Care Act in DC, but they got some things into the tax bill around the individual mandate, and that really impacts the whole system. And whether you like the Affordable Care Act or not, the fact that everything is just unsolid ground in DC has major ramifications for California, because the way our system works, there is an enormous amount of federal money that goes into healthcare for all the folks on Medi-Cal, that type of health insurance. So it's very difficult to figure out a way forward for healthcare and health insurance in California while that's happening in DC. It's a very challenging moment. So there's a big debate for a lot of folks who really want single payer. There's also a big debate by a number of folks who are pushing a package called the Healthcare for All package, which is a number of different bills that would address sort of making the Affordable Care Act better. Right? Lots of different things, making it more affordable, addressing prescription drugs, making it cover immigrants, things like that, which is sort of a more incremental approach, or a let's make it better in the meantime kind of approach. To your point, which was, should we, say it again, should we set up health insurance a plan? So it's hard to go around the federal government, unfortunately, because they control the money on this, is one aspect of it, and because of federal preemption law, we have rules about which part of government controls things, and so it's hard to do an end run, but we should be thinking about things like a public option in California, right? We all know a public option is sort of like halfway to single payer or something like that. So there's quite a debate happening, but it's a very complicated place to be right now. I will say my personal perspective is that some of the folks in Sacramento are being really called out in a very, very tough way for not being positive enough on single payer, and I'm not sure that's how I would describe the situation entirely. I think it's really complicated, who's a good player and who's a bad player on this, and very complicated for the advocates and for the elected officials. Yes, Luis. The thing about titles of bills, this is called marketing. There are various methods of challenging legally some of the things that they're doing at the federal government level. So some of the things where the Trump administration has said, oh, we're just going to not bother, or we're just going to sabotage that from the executive branch, from the administrative level, some of that is able to be challenged in court. The things that Congress is doing, it's much harder in terms of the pathways. To say I know I'm focused on immigration right now, but did you all see that the Trump administration is now considering that in order to decide who gets things like a green card, they will look at whether or not you've used public benefits? So have you taken advantage of food stamps? And by taken advantage, made use of, accessed food stamps or medical services. So a few things leave me speechless, but this really does. Because think about the ramifications of this, the incentives that are being created for undocumented members of our communities. Not only will people go hungry, people go without medical care, things like that, because they're afraid to access it. We've already seen that communities have stopped calling the cops because they think that the cops are going to deport them, right? That's one of the most important things about the California Values Act that we talked about earlier tonight, is that if you're a victim of domestic violence or of any other crime, you need to be able to call the cops and not think that you're going to get deported or someone else in your household's going to get deported. We don't actually want to create pockets of lawlessness within our communities. And we also don't want to create pockets of disease, because no one seeks health care, of it's boggling. It's mind-boggling. That is currently a proposed regulation, is I guess the easiest way to say it, at the federal level. So you should certainly comment to the federal government in opposition to that. But it's very difficult to make progress with this federal government.
Is this on? Yeah. What does the public option look like for California specifically?
Well, so this is still in a very early stage, but the idea would be that you could either buy your insurance on the exchange, right? The website, or you could, and maybe one of the options on the website would be a government-administered plan. So rather than it being, Aetna or Blue Cross or one of those companies, instead you would choose sort of the California government plan, and it would work more like Medicare. Right? So one of the ways that people talk about single payer is Medicare for all. Because Medicare actually works pretty well in many ways. So that's what a public option kind of setup would look like. Okay. I don't know where I am on my topic list. I'm so glad we wrote it down.
Reproductive health?
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment. Sacramento is certainly ahead of the curve. There's no other way to say it on reproductive rights. We are very lucky to live in California on this. That said, there are still sometimes challenges. And I think this is really an area where it's incumbent upon us to be looking for the way forward, right? Not just defense. This is an issue where we have to think about the way forward. There are lots of barriers to access. Things like affordability, like where clinics are located. And this isn't just about abortion, this is about birth control, this is about preventative health when it comes to reproductive health care. One of the bills that is doing very well right now and is moving along in the legislature requires that the University of California, forgive me, I can't remember if it's the UC, the Cal State, or the community colleges, or all of them, but one of the higher education institutions would be required to provide abortion can be either done surgically or through a prescription drug, the prescription drug type, through the health center. So that a woman who needed that could go to a health center on campus, which certainly reduces one of the barriers to access for those communities. There are also questions like, could we have nurse practitioners or folks like that perform these types of procedures in some cases rather than it having to always be doctors? And that turns into a complicated fight between the industries and the lobbyists that represent those different communities of professionals, right? So those are some of the conversations that happen. There was a huge fight a few years ago around the maximum family grant, which was a big, big victory when we won that. I'm sorry, this is an important one. Last year, the governor vetoed a reproductive rights bill, and folks were fairly disappointed in that. So in California, it's still possible for certain types of religious employers to, or employers generally, to fire someone based on their reproductive choices. So like if you work at a religious high school and you are not married and you're pregnant, they could fire you for getting pregnant outside of marriage. Or if you, I think that we had an example where someone made use of IVF, of in vitro fertilization, of assisted reproductive technologies, and their employer fired them for that. So there's a loophole in terms of those types of things, and there was a bill to close that loophole that the governor vetoed, and the bill is going to end up on his desk, I believe, again this year, and we very much hope to see a different outcome from Governor Brown on that item. I know there's a question on high-speed rail and also on the tunnels. I will say these are not my specialty areas, but I've done okay so far, right? Mm-hmm. So I can tell you that these are both Governor Brown's pet projects, you know that. They're both under a lot of pressure, and they are not projects that have a lot of champions other than Governor Brown at times. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to these projects when he's no longer governor, which, of course, this is his final year. The water tunnels, there's a lot of concern about the impact on the habitat in that particular area, in that delta, where the water is being taken from. I believe they recently scaled it back to be not 2 tunnels, but 1. Again, why am I speaking? So there's efforts to make it a more environmentally friendly, that's probably not the best, a less environmentally damaging proposal than it had been. And on the high-speed rail, there's a lot of pressure on this project, and there's questions on federal funding, which are at the heart of whether or not the project happens as well. But I'm sorry, I don't have detailed updates on those. What did I miss?
Well, I'm going to add one, which is
that's not fair.
education.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, education. Let's see, education. Well, let me answer this sort of a little bit more globally. The big fight in Sacramento is between what are called the education reform and the traditional educational efforts. The teachers union is very much on the sort of public education side. The education reform community is much more charter, those types of efforts. That's the big fight. And there are lots of bills coming from the education reform side that the more traditional public education side is constantly trying to put down. These are things around teacher tenure, around exams to determine whether or not teachers are continuing their efforts. From the public education traditional point of view, the challenge really is resources being sucked out of public schools to go into charter schools and things like that. There are also concerns about if you take out, things like voucher programs and other types of programs, even other charter programs, if you take out the kids whose parents care enough to move them, what is the population you leave behind? And it makes a difference who you're in a classroom with, right? Children are role models for each other, and that has an impact. But conversely, especially for poorer communities, often communities of color, they really feel that the traditional public education system is failing them in some really devastating ways. And I don't think a lot of people would totally disagree. The debate is really over where the solution is. So that is the global fight on education. It comes and it shows up in all of these little fights. There's an enormous amount of money on the education reform side. Oil and education reform are the most powerful moneyed interests in Sacramento right now, I would say. And they often work together to fund more conservative Democrats than what you would think of as a traditional Democrat. And so that's just on the political side, kind of the dynamic, because we have, leaving the sexual harassment and open seats aside right now, Democrats have 2/3 supermajorities in both houses, and so the Democrats have kind of split themselves in two, to the conservative Democrats and the traditional type of Democrat. And the interests that in other states fund Republicans or conservative proposals, in California they fund conservative Democratic proposals. One other thing on education is that early childhood education, prior to kindergarten, has been severely neglected in California. We had terrible cuts in things like childcare even in 2008, and we've been clawing our way back. And this is an area that is not Governor Brown's strong suit. It's not a place that he prioritizes for investment, and it's been very challenging, and we really hope that the next governor will take a different point of view. The other one that I really hope that the next governor will have a different point of view is just poverty investments. So all kinds of different programs to assist families that are really struggling. I believe it's fair to say that Governor Brown's view is that a lot of the anti-poverty programs don't work, and so he doesn't want to invest in them. I don't think that's a fair assessment. I think we need better solutions than we have, but I don't think cutting it off and he's not cutting it off, but he's not investing heavily in some of those programs, and I believe we need more investment than what we've had.
So that would lead us straight into affordable housing, which I think is also economic inequality in the state.
Yes. So there was an affordable housing package last year that was passed. That was a big step because Sacramento really hadn't grappled enough with this issue. The challenge, why this, and I think there's going to be a lot more legislation on this front this year too. But here's some of the reasons this is hard. Because you would think this would just be happening because it is such a problem for California. I mean, we all know it, and it's a huge problem no matter what economic level you're at. It's certainly very severe for folks who are much more economically fragile. But the cost of housing in California is insane for a whole range of areas. So why is it not getting fixed? Why is it not getting addressed? Well, it should, but here are some of the things that I think are challenges that stand in the way. One is that it's an issue of local control often, right? City councils, boards of supervisors have a lot of say over land use regulations and where we put businesses versus where we put homes and where we put apartment buildings versus where we put single homes, right? So you've got local state government fighting the state government. And then you've got the YIMBYs and the NIMBYs. Do you know what the YIMBYs and the NIMBYs are? The NIMBYs is a pejorative word for people who say not in my backyard. And the YIMBYs are the reactive opposition of yes in my backyard. So the criticism of a NIMBY would be they don't want it built where they live. They want it built somewhere else. And that could be whether we're talking about a shelter or a halfway house or yes, we do need more affordable housing somewhere else. And the people in that community say somewhere else. And you know, if nobody wants it in their community, then where do we put it? And so that's why the YIMBYs have said, we want it in our community, we're pro-development. So it's a very challenging to find the balance on this type of development question. And this plays into questions of rent control, and it's complicated. It's not easy, and it also links to our development of public transportation because there are, you know, transit-oriented development, putting housing near transit, those types of questions. There is a piece of legislation from Senator Wiener that's gotten a lot of attention this year, which attempts to make it easier to build housing right near public transit, like right near a subway stop. But there are some problems with it, and one of the problems is that it wipes out some of the incentives for affordable housing. So we would end up with development, but not necessarily affordable housing. There are also I believe some environmental concerns. So if you all want to get bloody, go up to Sacramento and talk about housing policy. It's a tough fight.
That's our list.
That's our list. Thank you very much. Those were great questions and great issues, and I hope I was able to address some of that. We've used a lot of time, but
we're good. We can keep going if we want open for
I'm
questions.
okay if you're all okay. Let's do some questions. Oh no, I'm okay. You're worried about these heels, aren't you?
Did you have a question or was that?
No, he wanted to know if I wanted a chair, which I thought was a great question. No, I'm okay. Thank you very much, though. Did you all see Leader Pelosi holding the floor in the House the other day? Yes, in like 4-inch heels. They had photos of those stiletto heels, and I just thought, oh, lady. I sent her a text message telling her she was inspiring. I didn't say that the inspiration was about the footwear. But yes, one day women will be able to hold the floor in flats.
Wendy Davis did that.
Yes, Wendy Davis also held the floor. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on what the anxiety or possible solutions with the federal tax reform and its particular impact on California?
Great question. The anxiety is real because the plan is terrible. This is the federal tax plan that was passed and signed into law and we're all going to live with. And it's especially bad for us in California. And this was just one of those moments of just disappointment in the functioning of our system because, yes, there are some policy reasons. Yes, I will summarize what happened, but... Oh, sorry? Oh, yes, I will that too. You don't want to just hear me complain. I know, I understand. There are some policy arguments for why they did what they did around state and local tax deductions, our ability to write off on our federal taxes the amount that we pay on state and local taxes and property taxes, right? They severely limited that. So in California, many of our taxes go up because of this. So there are some policy arguments you can make. I don't agree with them, but there are some you can make. But there is really just a fairly obvious sense in which this was political retribution. This was some folks saying, the blue states are the ones that are going to get hurt, and so let's just, and it was amazing because it actually hurt electorally some of the Republican House members in California who are going to get potentially hit hard on this issue, and it happened anyway. So in terms of Sacramento's response, and this is a bill by Kevin De Leon, he is looking at a bill to allow us to make a charitable contribution to our state government. I know, just, okay. Number one, this is not tax advice. Number two, I will say it again. It's a bill to allow us to make a charitable contribution to our state government. So you could, you know how you make a charitable contribution to a house of worship, a religious institution, a nonprofit, things like that, and you can write that off in your taxes? So you could kind of do the same thing. That's the idea, is that you could write a check to the state government and that they would allow, and this could be, it would be to like, yeah, it would be to a fund set up by the state government, essentially, and that would, they're trying to change the impact on your taxes so that you could do that, and then you could get that credit so that your taxes would not go up. Now, this is, if you can't tell, we're in creative territory. So I champion the creativity. I applaud the creativity. It's a good thing, but we're in creative territory. So you got to figure out how we're really going to do it, and they're still in the baking on this legislation of figuring it out. So I think it's good that they're trying to figure out, but they're still working on it. Now, there's a possibility that the federal government could close that loophole on us. We'll see if that happens. Also, I'm sorry, there was one other point I wanted to make on this. One of my concerns is that we need to have this set up in a way that it's not that only the people who know take advantage of it, right? So if you happen to have a tax attorney, and if you happen to be somebody who looks into it, you will be able to take advantage of it. So in some ways, the people who are going to get hit by the problem that the federal government created are wealthier people in some ways, and so maybe they will be more likely to know how to take advantage of it. But there are also some people who are probably not who we would consider wealthy, who are going to get hit, and they might not know to take advantage. So that would be one of my questions about the legislation, is how do we make sure that the ability to take advantage of this is equitably distributed? Because some of what we're talking about has to do with property taxes and property value, and we all know that when you tell someone in Kansas that you pay $10,000 in property taxes, they look at you like you must be incredibly wealthy, and then we tell them that's on an apartment, right? So we're in a very different situation than some other states when it comes to housing costs and property costs. Ma'am.
We see something in the mail in regard to, I'm loud. Yeah, something in the mail came through in regard to a petition to get rid of Proposition 13. Can you address that some way?
Yes, there's lots of ballot initiatives coming. There will be a few in June, but more in November. And these ballot initiatives are so tricky, always. Yes, there is going to be an effort to repeal or to repeal parts of and to change Prop 13. Prop 13, is everybody familiar with Prop 13? Many of you are, I'm sure. So I think that the biggest push, the biggest attempt to change is around instituting what's called a split roll, so that corporations and businesses are treated differently than homeowners. And one of the things that Prop 13 does is that it stops your property taxes from increasing exponentially because of the value of your property skyrocketing. And so there are some ways in which it's an important protection for homeowners, many of whom bought their home decades ago and don't have the money to buy it today, so we don't actually want to throw them out of their homes. But it results in things like Disneyland has been paying very close to the same taxes since 1979 when Prop 13 passed, right? So it's very unfair when you look at how businesses are taxed. Now, it's complicated because you've got small businesses that we need to also support. And I'm sorry, I'm distracted because my Fitbit is vibrating like crazy. Either I've done my 10,000 steps or someone's calling me, one or the other. I just got the Fitbit, and I think I haven't done a speech while wearing it before, and I might not do that anymore. But you can tell I'm personal fitness. We're trying here, right? That's one of the efforts around Prop 13 is to do some changes there. So what I have heard about the ballot initiative seems, I believe, is positive on that effort. So I might sign that petition if I were you.
You were talking about how the move is to keep it in the ground, and that we're pretty progressive and creative in California.
You are? Yes, we are.
In California in general. So I was wondering, what about fracking?
Yeah. Oh, fracking, yes. So, there's been a lot of pushes to try to ban fracking or to regulate it better, all kinds of things. And it has been challenging in Sacramento on this point. I would say that Governor Brown's a little complicated on this issue. And I don't see, as far as I know, I would not anticipate significant legislation on fracking this year. I think next year we might see that when we have a different governor. You look disappointed. Yeah, I know. Other questions? Anybody else? Let me just take one from this woman who hasn't asked one.
On that same note, even though it's local, is there anything being done in Sacramento about Aliso Canyon?
Oh, yeah, actually it is very much a topic in Sacramento. Senator Henry Stern, have you all met Senator Stern? He's relatively new to being a senator, but worked many years for Fran Pavley, the prior senator. He is focused on this issue like a laser beam and has been, I think, an incredible champion on it and is very much trying to prevent a reoccurrence of the health harms and the environmental harms that happened as a result, while also making sure that we have the energy resources we need to sustain such a large area like Los Angeles, and also trying to make sure that folks who were the victims of this disaster have the follow-up support and economic support that they might need in that process. So I apologize that I don't have specifics on the bills this year, but he's the foremost champion on it, and definitely his office would have tons of information on it.
How does the horse race look so far for replacing the current governor?
How much can I say on this?
Don't endorse, and then you can say whatever you want.
As long as I don't endorse, I can describe the facts. Got it. I'm an attorney, so I'm always careful. And I don't want all of you to get thrown out and arrested. I saw a police cruiser in the parking lot. I very much appreciate the public safety and. The governor's race, that's what I'm talking about. We have a lot of people running for governor. We have, I believe, 2 leading Republican candidates. We have 4 Democratic candidates. The one who is the highest in the polls and has the most money is Gavin Newsom, the current lieutenant governor, former mayor of San Francisco. There's also John Chung, our current state treasurer, former state controller, and Board of Equalization member. And there is Antonio Villaraigosa, former mayor of Los Angeles, also a former Speaker of the Assembly, member of the legislature. And there is Delane Easton, the only woman running, and a former superintendent of public instruction, the statewide education office, and member of the legislature. And the two of the Republicans are also members of the state legislature currently. So the big question is who makes it into the top two, right? Because we are blessed with a jungle primary in California. Boo. Jungle primary is a terrible policy in my opinion. Who makes it into the top two? Will we have a Republican in the race in November, or will it be between two Democrats? And that kind of bounces back and forth in the polling, which outcome there's going to be. Most people, I think, would say that regardless of whether you have two Democrats, one of them is going to run to the right. One of them is going to be trying to appear to be the more conservative candidate to draw in some of those Republican votes, right? They have to differentiate themselves. Right now, it's pretty clear to me that Antonio Villaraigosa is running to the right, is trying to position himself as a little bit more, or actually believes in the policies of being a little bit more conservative on some of these things. So, whereas I would say that John Chung and Gavin Newsom are in a more traditionally progressive Democratic posture, I think would be. And Delane Easton similarly is a pretty progressive candidate. Her fundraising and things are probably not where they need to be for her to be able to be in the general election. So it's likely that we're probably either looking at Gavin Newsom and a Republican, or Gavin Newsom and probably Antonio Villaraigosa. John Chung sort of does better in some polls than others, but is really fighting to get up in there. So how's that for horses? Thank you. No one's going to ask me about sexual harassment.
Oh, talk about that.
People. Okay, and then I promise I'll ask you, are you going to offer me a chair again? Because you might be my favorite
especially after
audience
what
member.
was said in the White House today about sexual harassment and
Yeah, and domestic violence, and yes. So there's a real wave of sexual harassment allegations and revelations happening in Sacramento, and there have been for a few months now, and they kind of continue. I think it's been a very important thing to happen. There clearly were a lot of things that needed to come out, and I think this is a very important moment. You're probably not shocked that I'm supportive of the folks who've come out and spoken strongly, and it's been a very difficult thing for them to do. I know some of them personally, and it's not easy. The politics is about relationships, and if you cross somebody, you can end your career. So it's really, really gutsy for the people who speak out, and to me, that says a lot about whether or not you should believe them, because many of them are risking their careers. We know statistically that I believe it's like 90%, something like that, of the women, this is based on studies that have been replicated, of women who come forward and speak about sexual assault are telling the truth, and this is a very similar type of thing. So, and the ones that you're seeing in the Los Angeles Times, the LA Times is going through a really vigorous process of vetting on these stories and of getting contemporaneous accounts and emails at the time and things like that. So I think that lends credibility to, unfortunately, many of the devastating things that we're hearing about people who should be leading figures of our community. So, in summary, sexual harassment is bad. It's it's very challenging in terms of the policy of how it should be handled in Sacramento. So there's a whole package of legislation that's being offered on how we should be addressing this, who you should be able to make a complaint to, how will the investigation work, what will be the consequences, does the person have to go on leave, can they get paid while they're being investigated, how do we handle this? And it is a little complicated. We certainly need to do better than what has been, and there are efforts already to improve it, and there's more coming on the legislative side. In the meantime, it is just rocking the political, the very small political world of people who care about state policy. But we already have 3 special elections in Los Angeles. It's possible that we'll see more, and it's really upending things. So it'll be very interesting to see all of the impacts of that. It means that Democrats do not have a supermajority in the Assembly because we have empty seats right now. And so it means that certain legislation has to wait until these special elections happen, things like that. It also, this was expected to be a year when there weren't going to be a lot of important legislative elections because nobody was termed out. Right? And, if you're in a Democratic seat, once you get in there, you stay for 12 years. If you're in a Republican seat, once you get in there, you stay for 12 years because of term limits, right? You're reelected, but incumbents rarely get challenged and rarely lose. And so this was supposed to be sort of a quiet year, and then it was Trump, and so we were all going to focus on the seats that could be flipped, depending on which side you're on, which direction you want to flip it. And now there are all of these special elections that are happening and potentially open seats, and it's just a totally different landscape. And it has the possibility of really having an impact on the composition of the state legislature. So right now we have about 20% women in the state legislature, which, that's only 30% lower than our proportion of the population. So there's that. Now, the United Nations says that in order to have an impact on the legislative body as a whole, and this was specifically regarding women, you need to at least be at 30%. So we've got 10% to go before we are even meeting the United Nations standards on being able to change the organizational culture of the legislature, being able to have an impact on sort of what policies are brought forward and how they get debated and what the outcomes are. So we have a long way to go. And it's not that women can't possibly sexually harass someone. A leading female legislator was accused just last night. But this is disproportionately something that impacts women, and women's experiences being at the table makes a difference in how it's handled in the legislature. So that's my 2 cents, is that we have to change the policies in response to it, and we have to hold people accountable, but we also have to think critically about who we are sending to Sacramento and which parts of our population are not adequately represented. And that's not just women, that's also thinking about LGBTQ candidates, about Latino candidates, African American candidates, and as an advocate friend of mine often reminds me, thinking about people who grew up poor, because that is a very, very different experience than the one many folks have growing up, or who are currently economically struggling as well. That didn't take long to get back to you.
That was great, too. Tying together some of your climate change experience and the water shortage, and I was wondering, with the news out of Cape Town, South Africa, which is exactly the same distance from the equator south as we are north, and 4 million people in Cape Town, and it's going to be completely out of water in about 8 weeks, early April. I mean, 0 water left. Is that a cautionary tale in Sacramento? Because the biggest city in the world built on a desert is Los Angeles.
Yeah, wow. I've been to Cape Town, but I was told tonight's conversation was about Sacramento, so I did not prepare on my Cape Town policy.
No, but I didn't know if in Sacramento, if they were seeing that as a cautionary tale, that we needed to do something about water.
I'm just teasing.
No,
I do that. So I think that's a great point. So what we do know is that we certainly have challenges around water in California. We've been in a drought. There are questions about whether we're going into another one or are we already in it, et cetera. So there's an acknowledgement, I think, by everyone in Sacramento about there being challenges. The question is more about which solutions. So I suppose you could say you have two different water fights happening in Sacramento. You've got everybody fighting over the water that exists and who owns it, and this is a major thing in the Central Valley, right, among some of the agricultural community and things like that. And then you've also got the fight about, well, how are we going to address things going forward? So certainly the tunnels is one debate. For me, I am a staunch environmentalist. I believe that the solutions come down to teaching us all to conserve. You know, we made efforts during the drought. I think many of us changed some of our behaviors. We stopped watering patches of grass between different lanes of highways because that might not be the best use of water. Things like that. So conservation and using less, but also thinking about recycling water and what are the ways in which we can do that. Orange County has a really promising program that's in place. And what's the third prong that I always talk about in terms of water policy? Capture, rainwater capture. So rain barrels and all kinds of programs to try to capture the water that is coming down. So there are a number of investments that need to be made in things like the recycling and the rainwater capture, as well as in teaching all of us to conserve better. But here's where we should not be investing, in my opinion. We should not be investing in desalination plants. And you've probably heard a lot about desal plants. There's a big debate happening in Orange County about a desal plant that is potentially being put in there. My concern about desal plants is several-fold. It can be very negatively harmful for the ocean life in terms of the water going in and the water coming out of the plant and the impact on the temperature and the things like that. So environmentally harmful in that way. But they use a lot of electricity. And we need to use less electricity, not more, for climate change reasons, right? So yes, we have... We're doing well in terms of our amount of renewable energy, and we're going to do even better, but it's still better not to be using all that power, and there are better solutions than desalination plants, in my opinion. Sir.
Okay, a little bit of a monkey wrench here, but it's kind of sort of related to the water stuff you were just mentioning, and that is the New California movement. And maybe you can. This was something I was not even aware of until just a couple of weeks ago, and maybe you can give the Reader's Digest version to everyone here what that's about, and whether or not you think that is an actual thing that could happen.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by the New California movement?
The New California movement is a idea in certain of the eastern counties, and especially the Central Valley, to secede from California and to create a 51st state.
Yeah, there's a kind of a couple of different versions of this, I suppose. There's the effort to turn us into 6 different states, right? To divide us up. There's also an effort to make our legislature into something more like Vermont's, where they have like a legislator for every 2 blocks. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's called like a neighborhood legislature plan where everybody would have hyper-local representation. And in a state of California, it would be humongous. I don't see a lot of promise for success of any of these plans right now, and I also don't think they're good ideas, personally, for me. But I'm not losing too much sleep over them at the moment.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yes.
I followed you around. You're a fantastic speaker and communicator of ideas. Are you politically motivated to do more?
Are you asking him if I'm going to run for office?
President.
Yeah, just start off with the easy stuff. That's very kind of you to ask, and I think I can manage to answer this.
You can answer that.
Okay, so I'm not running for anything at the moment. As you heard in my introduction, I did run for office in 2014 for the state Senate. I ended up in the top 2 in a Democrat-on-Democrat general election. And what I always joke about is that next time I will aim for the top 1. I would be honored to have that opportunity to serve the public someday, and perhaps at the right time I may have that chance. But in the meantime, I focus on doing the work and not on what my job title is. Right? So many of the issues that I'm talking about tonight that I'm able to work on in my day job are the things that I would have worked on as a legislator, and so get it done. I don't need honorable in front of my name. Excuse me. But I want to say thank you for asking, because it's very important that we ask women to run, because we don't have enough of them, as my earlier comments reflected. Yeah, we're supposed to have that conversation about how to take action, right? So should we talk about that for just a minute while I drink water? So what to do to take action? Well, I will say that you live in a particularly interesting area, assuming most of you live right around here. I know and like and support many of the people you are represented by, right? Jackie Irwin in the Assembly, Henry Stern in State Senate, Julie Brownlee in Congress. Those are all districts that are not necessarily always easy for a progressive candidate to win. And so those are districts where your representatives are under a lot more pressure than a representative of West Los Angeles, for example. So they hear from a lot more conservative voices in their constituents, and they often, all three, are thinking about whether or not they will have a challenger in their race from the right, a more conservative challenger, sometimes of a different political party. So it's very important for you to engage those three folks, because they need to hear from you, and they're under a lot of pressure, and it's very important that they hear from folks who share your views to help them to make the best choices and feel that they have the support in the community to be able to do so. So please take that seriously and actually follow through on that and engage with them. Number one. Yes, ma'am.
Jackie Irwin is having a coffee at Pete's on Moore Park this Sunday between 9:30 and 11.
There you go. Great opportunity. Go and ask her about the questions that I didn't know the answers to tonight. Tell her I said hello as well. She'll ask why I was in her assembly district, but tell her I said hi. No, she's a friend. It'll be good. So in addition to talking with them, there's so much that can be done on the political side in terms of knocking on doors and making phone calls, and there are lots of districts that aren't that far from here that decide things like control of Congress and of the state legislature, and there are lots of ways to get involved. So I'm happy to offline provide people with information on how to do that. There are lots and lots of chances, that's for sure.
I think we can...
I've exhausted them.
I want to thank Sandra and invite you all over for some decaf and cookies across the way right over there. We can follow up with conversations.
Well, let me just say thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for coming out. And despite being an incredibly informed and active audience, I hope there were some things that were useful and new, and I really enjoyed speaking with you. It was way better than spending the evening with my husband, so, just like... I had dinner with him just last night, and we can't spoil him with too much attention, so... Thank you, and I really enjoyed getting to talk with you. And if you didn't get a chance to sign the sign-in sheet and you think that anything that I said was interesting and useful, I send out things and I put on social media opportunities for you to take action. So you will see times when you really need to call so-and-so and what's happening on bills and things like that. So that's one of the ways that I hope to be able to galvanize all of us into a world-changing army, right? So thank you all.